The moment my daughter's wedding planner directed me toward the back corner of the reception hall, I knew something was wrong. "Mrs. Donovan, you'll be seated right over here," she said with a practiced smile, gesturing toward a table half hidden, behind a decorative pillar, where the catering staff was taking their breaks between serving courses. Before I continue this story, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I stood frozen, clutching my small beaded purse, the one I'd spent months searching for to match the dusty rose mother of the bride dress I'd sewn myself. Across the elegant ballroom, my ex-husband Richard laughed boisterously at the head table, his arm draped around his new wife Vanessa, who was whispering something in my daughter Olivia's ear. That's when Marcus Patel, the owner of Rosewood Manor, happened to walk by. His eyes widened in recognition as he did a double-take. "Mrs. Donovan? Margaret Donovan?" he asked, his voice cutting through the ambient chatter. The Margaret Donovan, who taught at Westlake Elementary for 27 years. The one who stayed after hours to help my son overcome his reading disability when everyone else had given up on him. 6 months earlier, Olivia had called me with the news of her engagement to Bradley. I'd been in the middle of organizing my modest apartment, downsized significantly after the divorce 3 years prior. I remember nearly dropping the phone in excitement. "Mom, Brad proposed last night. We're getting married in June." Her voice bubbled with joy, and I felt my heart swell with happiness for her. "Oh, sweetheart, that's wonderful news," I exclaimed, already mentally calculating what I could put aside from my teacher's pension each month to help with the wedding costs. "We're thinking of having it at Rosewood Manor. It's absolutely stunning," she continued. "Dad's already offered to cover most of it. Isn't that amazing?" My smile faltered slightly. Richard had walked out after 32 years of marriage when he'd been promoted to managing partner at his law firm. Suddenly, the quiet, supportive wife who'd put him through law school while teaching full-time and raising our children wasn't sophisticated enough for his new circle. Vanessa, his executive assistant 20 years his junior, apparently was. "That's very generous of him," I managed to say, keeping my tone light for Olivia's sake. "And Mom," she hesitated, "Vanessa has offered to help plan everything. She has connections with all the best vendors in town." I gripped the phone tighter, pushing down the rising knot in my throat. "I see. It's just that she's friends with the top wedding planner in the city, and she can get us discounts on everything," Olivia rushed to explain. "And with Dad covering most of the cost, it makes sense to let them handle it." "Of course, darling," I said softly. "Whatever makes your day special." What followed were months of being gradually pushed to the periphery of my only daughter's wedding preparations. Every suggestion I made was politely acknowledged, then discarded. The dress I thought would be beautiful on Olivia wasn't on trend. The family recipe book I'd hoped to compile as wedding favors was deemed too homespun for the elegant affair they were planning. My son Jake, who lived across the country with his wife and new baby, called me regularly, concerned. "Are you okay, Mom? Olivia mentioned that you haven't been very involved in the wedding planning." "I'm fine, honey," I assured him, even as I stared at the wedding invitation that had arrived that morning, formally addressed to Mrs. Margaret Donovan, as if I were a distant acquaintance rather than the mother of the bride. "You raised us alone after Dad left," Jake pressed. "Worked 2 jobs to keep us in the same school district so we wouldn't have to move. Olivia seems to have forgotten all that since she started working at Dad's firm." After graduating with honors in law, Olivia had joined her father's prestigious firm, quickly climbing the ranks with his influence. Over time, I'd watched as she adopted more and more of Richard's perspectives and values. "She hasn't forgotten," I defended her, though part of me wondered if she had. "She's just excited about her wedding, and your father is paying for most of it. That doesn't give them the right to sideline you, Mom." I sighed, looking around. At my small living room. After the divorce, Richard had kept our spacious colonial in the prestigious Lakeview neighborhood while I'd moved into this two-bedroom apartment closer to my school. I'd never complained, had never been the type to demand more than I needed. My salary as an elementary school teacher hadn't contributed much to our household income compared to Richard's six-figure earnings, a fact he'd emphasized during the divorce proceedings. Your mother was well compensated for her contributions to the marriage, Richard had told the children after it was finalized, as if 32 years of marriage could be settled with a check. The week before the wedding, Olivia invited me to lunch, the first time we'd met one-on-one in months. She looked stunning but tense as she picked at her salad. "Mom," she began carefully, "I wanted to talk to you about the seating arrangements for the reception." "Oh?" I took a small sip of water, sensing what was coming. "Dad and Vanessa have invited some really important people. The mayor, 2 state judges, Senator Wilson and his wife." She trailed off, twisting her napkin. "They've had to make some adjustments to accommodate everyone." "I understand, sweetheart. The thing is," she continued, not meeting my eyes, "the head table is now reserved for Dad, Vanessa, Brad's parents, and the bridal party. There's just not room for everyone." I sat very still, absorbing what she wasn't quite saying. "Where will I be seated then?" Olivia flushed. "There's a nice table near the back. It's quieter there, and I know how you get overwhelmed in crowds sometimes." The excuse was flimsy. I'd been an elementary school teacher for nearly 3 decades, managing classrooms of energetic children. Crowds had never bothered me. "I see," I said, forcing myself to smile. "Whatever works best for the flow of the day." Relief washed over her face. "Thanks, Mom. You always understand." But I didn't understand. Not really. As I drove home from that lunch, tears blurred my vision so badly that I had to pull over. What had happened to my sweet daughter who once made me Mother's Day cards proclaiming me her best friend forever? When had I become someone to be tucked away in a corner, out of sight? On the morning of the wedding, I arrived at the church, early, hoping to spend a few quiet moments with Olivia before the ceremony. The bridal suite was chaotic. Photographers, bridesmaids, makeup artists, all swirling around my daughter, who was a vision in white. "Mom!" she exclaimed when she saw me. "You're early." "I thought I could help you get ready," I said, holding up the vintage handkerchief I'd brought, the same one my mother had carried at her wedding and I at mine. Something blue for my beautiful girl. Olivia's eyes softened momentarily, but then Vanessa swept in, resplendent in a designer gown that probably cost more than 3 months of my pension. "Oh, Margaret, there you are. We were wondering when you'd arrive." Her tone suggested I was late rather than early. "Olivia, the photographer wants to take the formal family portraits now, with your father." I stood awkwardly as Olivia was whisked away. One of the bridesmaids, Rachel, Olivia's college roommate, gave me a sympathetic look. "The mother of the bride photos will be later," she assured me. But later never came. Somehow, in the rush of pre-ceremony activities, the photographer never found time for those photos. Before I knew it, I was being ushered to my seat in the front pew. At least for the ceremony, I was granted my proper place. The wedding itself was breathtaking. When Richard walked Olivia down the aisle, I bit my lip to keep from crying. Not just from the beauty of the moment, but from the painful awareness that on this day, more than ever, I felt the impact of how completely he had replaced me in our daughter's life. After the ceremony, guests made their way to Rosewood Manor, an exquisite historic estate converted into an exclusive event venue. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over ivory linens and elaborate floral centerpieces. A string quartet played softly in the corner. Every detail was perfect, curated, and elegant. And there I stood, in my carefully chosen dress, clutching my modest beaded purse as the wedding planner directed me to the staff table behind a pillar. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That's when Marcus Patel, the owner, recognized me. The warmth in his eyes as he called my name was the first genuine welcome I'd felt all day. "Mrs. Donovan, what are you doing all the way back here?" he asked, loud enough that several nearby guests turned to look. "You're Olivia's mother, the mother of the bride." The wedding planner shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Patel, we've arranged the seating according to the bride and groom's wishes." Marcus's expression darkened. "Is that so?" He turned back to me, taking my elbow gently. "Mrs. Donovan, this wonderful woman saved my son's life, you know," he announced to those within earshot. Ryan had severe dyslexia. Every teacher had given up on him until Mrs. Donovan stayed after school, 3 days a week for an entire year, developing special techniques to help him read. He just graduated from medical school last month. A murmur rippled through the nearby guests. From across the room, I saw Richard straighten up, suddenly alert to the small commotion. "Please," Marcus continued, guiding me toward the front of the room. "Let me show you to a more appropriate table." And just like that, the man whose son I'd taught 15 years earlier led me past the startled wedding planner, past the whispering guests, past my ex-husband's suddenly wary gaze, to an empty seat at a table just adjacent to the head table. A table with Olivia's childhood godparents, my closest friend from the school where I taught, and several family members who looked pleasantly surprised to see me join them. "Is everything all right here?" Richard appeared at my elbow, his smile tight, eyes darting between Marcus and me. "Everything is perfect now, Mr. Donovan," Marcus replied smoothly. "Just ensuring the mother of your beautiful daughter has the proper place at this celebration. I'm sure the seating arrangement was simply an oversight." The way he emphasized oversight made it clear he believed it was anything but. Richard's jaw tightened, but with so many witnesses, he could only nod stiffly and retreat. Across the room, Vanessa was watching with narrowed eyes. And at the head table, Olivia looked confused and slightly alarmed. As I settled into my new seat, my friend Diane squeezed my hand under the table. "About time someone recognized who you really are," she whispered. That moment marked the beginning of a shift, not just in how others at the wedding saw me, but in how I saw myself. For too long, I had allowed myself to be diminished, pushed aside, made to feel that my contributions weren't valuable because they couldn't be measured in dollars or status. But as Marcus Patel had just reminded everyone, including me, there are different kinds of wealth, different forms of contribution. And some of the most important ones never show up on a balance sheet. As I sat at my new table, the weight of years spent in the shadows began to press upon me. Marcus's unexpected intervention had done more than change my seating arrangement. It had cracked open a door to memories I'd carefully tucked away, memories of who I'd been before I became simply Richard's ex-wife, or Olivia and Jake's mother. The string quartet transitioned to a waltz, and couples began moving toward the dance floor. I watched as Richard guided Vanessa with practiced ease, her designer gown shimmering under the chandeliers. They made a striking pair, both tall, polished, exuding the kind of confidence that comes from never doubting your place in the world. My mind drifted back to another dance, 35 years earlier, when I'd first met Richard at a university fundraiser. I was 22 then, working on my teaching degree while tutoring to pay for my education. Richard was in his second year of law school, brilliant and ambitious, with a charisma that drew people to him like moths to flame. "You're different," he'd told me that night as we swayed to the music. "Everyone else here is trying so hard to impress. But you're just genuinely interested in people." I'd blushed, unused to such attention from someone like him. The son of a federal judge, Richard Donovan moved through life with an easy assurance I both admired and found slightly intimidating. "I find people fascinating," I'd replied. "Everyone has a story worth hearing." He'd laughed, delighted. Even me? What's my story then? I remember studying him, really looking. You're afraid of disappointing your father, I'd said quietly. You want to succeed on your own terms, but you're not sure what those terms are yet. His smile had faltered, and I'd worried I'd overstepped. But then he'd pulled me closer. Dance with me again tomorrow night? We were married 18 months later, against the subtle but unmistakable disapproval of his family. Richard's mother, a society matron who traced her lineage to the Mayflower, had taken me aside at our engagement party. Teaching is a noble profession, she'd said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. But you might want to consider something more substantial once you're a Donovan. I'd assured her I was passionate about education, that working with children was my calling. She'd merely patted my hand, as if I were a child myself who didn't understand how the world worked. In those early years, Richard had defended my career choices. Maggie doesn't need to be on charity boards or hosting dinner parties, he'd told. His mother, firmly, she's making a real difference in children's lives. We'd lived in a small apartment then, with second-hand furniture and ambitious dreams. I'd rise early to grade papers. He'd stay up late reviewing cases. On weekends, we'd picnic in the park because restaurants were beyond our budget. Those had been lean years, but full of purpose and partnership. Mrs. Donovan? A gentle voice pulled me back to the present. It was Diane, my colleague from Westlake Elementary. You look like you're miles away. I smiled at her, grateful for the familiar face. Just remembering. Good memories, I hope. Some of them, I admitted. I glanced toward the head table where Olivia sat beside her new husband, radiant in her happiness. At least in this, Richard and I had succeeded. Our daughter was confident, accomplished, loved. The dinner service began, servers presenting elegantly plated meals with choreographed precision. I couldn't help but notice that at my original assigned table, the staff were eating in quick shifts, some standing to make room for others. The thought that I was meant to be there, tucked away behind a pillar, sent a renewed wave of hurt through me. You know, Diane said, following my gaze, I always wondered how you managed it all. Teaching full-time, raising the children, supporting Richard's career, volunteering at the literacy center. You made it look effortless. I nearly choked. On my water. Effortless? Diane, there were days I barely kept my head above water. But you never complained, not once. She shook her head in admiration. Meanwhile, Richard was taking all the credit for the family's success. I wanted to defend him, an old habit, but found I couldn't, because she was right. As Richard's career had flourished, moving from associate to partner to managing partner, the narrative of our lives had subtly shifted. His colleagues saw me as the supportive wife, a pleasant backdrop to his ambition. Few knew or remembered that I had worked 60-hour weeks to support us while he was in law school, or that I had declined a promising position as curriculum developer to stay in our school district when his first big promotion had fallen through. Across the reception hall, the wedding photographer was capturing candid moments of the celebration. I watched as she knelt to take a picture of Richard toasting with a group of distinguished-looking men, likely the judges and politicians Olivia had mentioned. Would you excuse me for a moment? I said to Diane, suddenly feeling restless. I made my way around the perimeter of the room, nodding politely to faces I recognized, parents of former students, distant cousins, neighbors from our old community. Near the gift table, I paused, admiring the elegant display of wrapped packages. Quite the affair, isn't it? I turned to find Marcus Patel standing beside me, a glass of sparkling water in hand. Yes, I agreed. Olivia wanted the perfect day. And yet they seated you with the kitchen staff. His directness was refreshing after months of polite evasions. I lowered my voice. Thank you for what you did earlier. It was very kind. Kind? He raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Donovan, it was the bare minimum of respect. My son Ryan would never have graduated high school, let alone medical school, if not for you. When other teachers said he was lazy or not trying hard enough, you were the one who recognized his dyslexia and fought for his accommodations. I felt a flush of pride at the memory. Ryan had been a bright, frustrated 10-year-old, increasingly withdrawn as he fell behind his peers. I'd recognized the signs from my special education coursework and had pushed for testing, then developed individualized strategies to help him navigate his learning challenges. "How is Ryan doing now?" I asked, genuinely curious. Marcus beamed. "He just started his residency at Boston Children's Hospital. Pediatrics. He says he wants to help kids the way you helped him." He shook his head. "You know, we tried to invite you to his medical school graduation, but we couldn't find your contact information. Richard told us you had moved and left no forwarding address." I froze. "He said what?" "That you'd moved away, possibly to Arizona to be with your sister." Marcus frowned. "I take it that's not accurate?" "I don't have a sister," I said faintly. "And I've been living in the same apartment downtown for 3 years. Ever since." I trailed off, unable to finish. Understanding dawned in Marcus's eyes. "Ever since the divorce?" I nodded, a cold realization washing over me. How many other connections had Richard severed on my behalf? How many invitations, messages, or opportunities had been redirected or buried? A movement near the entrance caught my attention. Jake, my son, was arriving late, having missed the ceremony due to a delayed flight. He spotted me and made his way across the room, his face lighting up. "Mom!" He wrapped me in a bear hug, lifting me slightly off the ground. At 30, Jake was the spitting image of Richard in his youth, but with a warmth and openness his father had lost somewhere along the way. "Sorry I'm so late. The baby was fussy, and then our flight got delayed, and Amanda's still at the hotel putting Lily down for a nap." "I'm just glad you're here now," I said, blinking back tears. Despite living across the country, Jake called me several times a week. Unlike Olivia, who seemed to have absorbed Richard's redefined version of our family history, Jake remembered things as they were. I introduced him to Marcus, explaining their connection. "Wait, you're Ryan Patel's father?" Jake's face broke into a wide grin. "Ryan and I played soccer together in high school. How's he doing? Last I heard he was in medical school." As the men chatted, I excused myself to find the restroom, needing a moment to process what I'd just learned about Richard's deception. In the elegant powder room, I stood before the mirror, studying my reflection. The woman who looked back at me seemed both familiar and strange. The same blue eyes, the same laugh lines, but something different in the set of her jaw. Harder, perhaps, or simply more resolved. The door swung open and I tensed as Vanessa entered. She faltered slightly upon seeing me, her perfect composure slipping for just an instant before she recovered. "Margaret," she said with a tight smile. "I see you've been upgraded." I met her gaze steadily. "Yes, thanks to Marcus Patel. Apparently, he remembers what it means to show respect to others." A flush crept up her neck. The seating arrangements were complicated, so many protocols to consider with the distinguished guests. "Of course," I replied evenly. "Protocol. Like seating the mother of the bride with the catering staff." Vanessa's eyes narrowed. "Richard mentioned you might be difficult today. Did he also mention that he's been lying about my whereabouts to former students' families, telling them I moved to Arizona?" She blinked, genuinely surprised. "I don't know what you're talking about." "No, I don't suppose you do." I moved toward the door, then paused. "Vanessa, a word of advice. Start keeping your own money in your own name, because when Richard decides you're no longer an asset to his image, you'll find yourself discarded just as quickly as I was." I left her standing there, mouth slightly agape. As I made my way back to the reception, I felt a strange lightness. For 3 years, I'd carried the weight of my failed marriage like a stone in my chest. The humiliation of being replaced. The hurt of watching Olivia gradually align herself with her father's narrative. The financial insecurity of starting over at 55. But now, with each step, I felt something shifting. The carefully constructed version of events that Richard had crafted, poor Margaret, too simple for his sophisticated world, too limited in her ambitions, graciously provided for after the divorce, was beginning to unravel. I rejoined my table just as the best man was concluding his toast. Jake had saved me a seat beside him, and he leaned over as I sat down. "Mom, what's this I hear about you being seated with the staff originally?" I sighed. "It's nothing, Jake. A misunderstanding." "Bullshit," he said, low enough that only I could hear. "That was deliberate. Dad's fingerprints are all over it." Before I could respond, the DJ announced it was time for the father-daughter dance. Richard led Olivia onto the floor, and they began to sway to Butterfly Kisses, the song she'd loved since childhood. They made a striking pair, Olivia in her white gown, Richard distinguished in his tuxedo, both of them fair-haired and fine-featured. I watched them, a familiar ache in my chest. Not jealousy exactly, but something more complex. Grief for what had been lost, for the family we once were, for the years I'd spent believing in a partnership that had ultimately been transactional. "You should have been announced properly when you arrived," Jake muttered. "And there should be a mother-daughter dance." I patted his hand. "It's her day, Jake. Let her have it without drama." "That's always been your problem, Mom. You let them get away with too much." His words stung because they echoed a voice I'd been hearing in my own head with increasing frequency. Had my accommodation, my desire to keep the peace, my willingness to step back and let Richard take center stage contributed to my current situation? Had I, in some fundamental way, taught my husband and daughter that my feelings were secondary, my presence optional? As the dance ended to enthusiastic applause, I found myself remembering another moment. Olivia at 7, her small hand in mine as we walked home from school. "Mommy," she'd asked, "why doesn't Daddy come to my school plays?" I'd answered automatically, the words practiced and smooth. "Daddy's job is very important, sweetheart. He helps people with big problems, and sometimes that means he can't be at every event. But he loves you very much. Does he love you very much too?" I'd hesitated just a fraction too long, and her perceptive little face had clouded. "Daddy's very busy," I'd finally said, "and grown-up love is complicated sometimes." Looking back, I wondered what lessons she'd absorbed from that conversation and the hundreds like it. Had I taught her that women's needs were less important? That love meant making yourself smaller to accommodate someone else's greatness? The music shifted to an upbeat dance number, and guests began to fill the floor. Jake nudged me. "Come on, Mom. Let's show these stuffy lawyers how it's done." I laughed and let him pull me up. My son had always been a terrible dancer, enthusiastic, but utterly lacking in rhythm. As we joined the crowd, I caught sight of Richard watching us, his expression unreadable. For the next hour, I allowed myself to simply enjoy the celebration. I danced with Jake, with Diane, even with Marcus Patel, who turned out to be surprisingly light on his feet. I chatted with Olivia's godparents, whom I hadn't seen since the divorce, and discovered they'd tried to stay in touch, but my emails had apparently bounced back. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Richard had been thorough in his erasure of me, it seemed. As the evening progressed, I noticed Olivia casting glances in my direction. She seemed confused by the attention I was receiving, by the easy laughter at our table, by the steady stream of former students' parents who came to greet me once word spread that I was present. "Mrs. Donovan, I didn't know you'd be here." It was Emily Chen, whose twins I'd taught 8 years earlier. "The boys are in high school now, if you can believe it. They still talk about your Egyptian mummy project. And they're still into archaeology," I asked, remembering how the twins had been fascinated by ancient civilizations. Emily beamed. Tyler just got accepted to the University of Chicago's Archaeological Studies program. He mentioned you in his application essay about how you made history come alive and taught him that the past has important lessons for the present. Warmth spread through me. This was why I'd become a teacher, to ignite curiosity, to help children discover their passions, to be a positive force in their development. In the wake of the divorce, with Richard's subtle denigration of my career, it's not that teaching isn't valuable, it's just not substantial. I'd sometimes questioned the impact of my life's work. But here was evidence that couldn't be diminished or explained away. I had made a difference, a significant one. As Emily moved on, Jake leaned closer. You see, Mom? All these people remember how amazing you are, even if Dad tried to make you feel insignificant. I squeezed his hand, grateful for his unwavering support. Across the room, I noticed Olivia in deep conversation with Richard, both of them glancing in my direction. Her expression was troubled, his defensive. After a moment, she shook her head and walked away from him, moving purposefully across the reception hall, toward me. Mom, she said, her voice tight as she reached our table. Can we talk privately for a moment? I excused myself and followed her to a small anteroom off the main hall. As soon as the door closed behind us, Olivia turned to me, her composure cracking. What's going on? Why is everyone making such a fuss over you? The question, so nakedly revealing in its assumptions, took my breath away. I studied my daughter's face, the face I'd memorized from her first moments of life, the face I'd watched transition from baby to child to woman, and saw a stranger looking back at me. What's going on? I said carefully. Is that I'm your mother, and this is your wedding day, and people who care about me are showing me the respect I'm due. Is that a problem for you, Olivia? She flushed. That's not what I meant. It's just, Dad said you preferred to keep a low profile, that you didn't want to be the center of attention. Did he? It wasn't a question. And now Mr. Patel is telling everyone about how you helped his son, and all these people are coming up to you, and it's disrupting the flow of the reception. I took a deep breath, trying to contain the hurt her words inflicted. Olivia, do you actually hear yourself? You're upset because people are acknowledging my existence, my contributions? Because it's disrupting the flow of your wedding to have your mother recognized as someone of value? She had the grace to look ashamed. That came out wrong. No, I think it came out exactly as you meant it. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. I need you to understand something. I have allowed myself to be sidelined, diminished, and erased for years. I did it because I thought it was best for you and Jake, that maintaining a cordial relationship with your father was worth sacrificing my own dignity. But I'm done with that now. Mom, I'm not finished, I interrupted, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm me. Your father has been actively cutting me off from my professional network, lying about where I live, isolating me, and you have been complicit in it. Tears welled in her eyes. That's not fair. I didn't know. You didn't want to know, I corrected her, because it was easier to accept his version of events. Poor, simple mom, not sophisticated enough for Dad's world, not educated enough, not ambitious enough, not enough. But here's the truth, Olivia. I put your father through law school by working 60-hour weeks. I turned down career advancement opportunities because his job required us to stay in this city. I raised you and Jake to believe in yourselves because I believed in you first. Tears were streaming down her face now, mascara creating dark tracks on her flushed cheeks. I never thought you weren't enough, she whispered. Didn't you? Then why was I seated with the catering staff at your wedding? She looked away, unable to meet my eyes. The wedding planner said there wasn't room at the family tables. with Dad and Vanessa and Brad's parents and the bridal party. And you accepted that explanation without question, without standing up for me. Olivia wiped at her tears, smearing her carefully applied makeup further. I didn't want to cause problems. Dad was paying for everything, and Vanessa's connections got us this venue at half price, and it just seemed easier to push me into the background, I finished for her, to treat me as an afterthought. I'm sorry, she said, and I believed she meant it. But an apology wasn't enough. Not after years of gradual estrangement, of watching her adopt her father's attitudes and perspectives, of being treated as dispensable. I want you to really think about something, Olivia. When you have children someday, what kind of example do you want to set for them? That it's acceptable to discard people once they're no longer useful? That loyalty and sacrifice mean nothing compared to status and money? That your mother deserves to be hidden away behind a pillar on one of the most important days of your life? She flinched as if I'd slapped her. Mom, please, it's my wedding day. Yes, it is. And I love you enough to be honest with you, even today, because I raised you to be better than this. I moved toward the door, then paused. I'm going back to the reception now. I'm going to celebrate your marriage with joy and grace, because that's who I am. And tomorrow, we're going to have a long, honest conversation about what kind of relationship we want to have moving forward. I walked out, leaving her standing. There, tear-streaked and stunned. As I returned to my table, I caught Richard's eye across the room. He must have seen something in my expression, some new resolve, some unbreakable certainty, because for the first time in our long history, together he looked away first. Jake stood as I approached. Everything okay, Mom? I smiled at him, a genuine smile that came from a place of newfound clarity. Not yet, I said. But I think it will be. The DJ announced it was time to cut the cake. As Olivia and Brad moved to the center of the room, I noticed her searching the crowd until her eyes found me. She seemed smaller somehow, less certain of herself. When she located me, she gave a tiny nod, an acknowledgement that something significant had shifted between us. I nodded back, my heart aching with a complex mix of love, disappointment, and hope. As the couple sliced into their 5-tier cake, guests cheered and cameras flashed. I watched my daughter, brilliant, ambitious, at times misguided, and saw both the child she had been and the woman she was becoming. I had given her roots, but Richard had given her wings. Neither contribution was more valuable than the other. It was past time for her to understand that. Beside me, Diane leaned close. Whatever you said to her in there, I think it landed. She looks like someone just woke her from a long sleep. I hoped she was right. Because the truth was, I had been sleeping too. Sleepwalking through the aftermath of my divorce, accepting the diminished role I'd been assigned, allowing my narrative to be written by someone else. But now I was awake, and I had no intention of closing my eyes again. The remainder of the wedding reception passed in a blur of music, champagne, and forced smiles. After my conversation with Olivia, I maintained a dignified presence, dancing. When invited, chatting with guests who sought me out, and applauding appropriately during the traditional moments. But beneath my composed exterior, something fundamental had shifted. When the bouquet toss came, I deliberately stepped back, watching as younger women jostled for position. Vanessa, standing at Richard's side, caught my withdrawal and smiled, triumphantly, as if my reluctance to participate confirmed my irrelevance. She leaned in to whisper something to Richard, who glanced my way with a dismissive smirk. That look, so casual in its contempt, crystallized everything for me. For 32 years, I had been married to a man who saw me as a supporting character in his life story. And when that story required a more glamorous co-star, I'd been rewritten out of the narrative altogether. You deserve better than this, Marcus said quietly, appearing beside me with a glass of sparkling water. Then all of this. I accepted the drink gratefully. Thank you for everything today. Don't thank me yet, he replied cryptically. The evening's not over. Before I could ask what he meant, the DJ's voice boomed over the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, the father of the bride would like to say a few words. Richard moved to the center of the dance floor, microphone in hand, every inch the successful attorney. His silver hair caught the light, his tuxedo perfectly tailored to his tall frame. He looked exactly like what he was, a man accustomed to commanding attention, to being heard, to having his version of events accepted without question. First, I want to thank everyone for coming to celebrate Olivia and Brad's special day, he began smoothly. As many of you know, watching your daughter get married is a profound experience. Seeing the young woman you raised begin a new chapter, building her own family. He paused for effect. It's a culmination of years of guidance, love, and investment. Investment. As if raising a child were a financial transaction with expected returns. Olivia has always been exceptional, Richard continued. From her academic achievements to her promising legal career, she's been a source of immense pride. And much of that success comes from having grown up in a home that valued excellence, that set high standards. The implication was clear to anyone who knew our history, that it was his influence, his standards, his values that had shaped Olivia into the accomplished woman she was today. Now she's found her perfect match in Brad, a young man of similar caliber and ambition. Richard raised his glass. To the happy couple, may your life together be as rewarding and successful as you both deserve. Polite applause followed. I clapped mechanically, a strange numbness settling over me. It wasn't that I expected Richard to acknowledge my role in raising our children. We'd been divorced for 3 years, and this was hardly the place for such recognition. But the complete erasure of my contribution, the rewriting of our family, history with himself as the primary architect of our children's success, struck me as a final, unforgivable revision. And now, the DJ announced, the mother of the bride would like to share a few words as well. I froze. I hadn't prepared a speech, hadn't been asked to give one, hadn't expected to be acknowledged at all, let alone invited to speak. All eyes turned to me, including Richard's, whose expression flickered between surprise and annoyance. Marcus gave me a gentle nudge. Go on, he whispered. I took the liberty of adding you to the program. She's your daughter, too. Heart pounding, I made my way to the center of the floor. The DJ handed me the microphone, and for a terrifying moment, I thought my mind would go completely blank. But then I looked across the sea of faces and found Jake, giving me an encouraging thumbs up. Beside him, I spotted Olivia, her expression a complex mix of uncertainty and what might have been hope. Thank you, I began, my voice steadier than I expected. I hadn't planned to speak today, so please forgive me if my words aren't as polished as they should be. I took a deep breath, centering myself. When Olivia was 5 years old, she came home from kindergarten in tears because another little girl had told her she couldn't be a princess and a doctor at the same time. She had to choose one or the other. A soft murmur of amusement rippled through the crowd. I sat her down and told her something I've repeated throughout her life. You never have to choose between the parts of yourself that matter. The right people will embrace all of who you are. My eyes found Olivia's. Brad, I see the way you look at my daughter, with complete acceptance and admiration. You recognize her intelligence, her drive, her occasional stubbornness, and you love all of it, all of her. Brad nodded, his arm tightening around Olivia's waist. Olivia, I continued, you were a remarkable child, curious, determined, passionate about justice even before you knew what the word meant. I remember you at 7, creating a court in our backyard to settle a dispute between neighborhood children over a broken toy. You insisted everyone deserved to be heard. That fairness mattered above all else. Olivia's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Those values, compassion, fairness, the belief that everyone deserves dignity, those weren't taught in textbooks. They were lived day by day, in small moments and quiet conversations. I paused, feeling the weight of what I was about to say. No matter what changes life brings, no matter how families evolve or relationships shift, those fundamental truths remain, and I see them in you still, in the woman you've become. I raised my glass, addressing the entire room now. To Olivia and Brad, may your marriage be built on mutual respect, genuine partnership, and the understanding that love isn't about power or status or who contributes what. It's about seeing each other completely and choosing each other anyway. A deeper, warmer applause followed my words. As I handed back the microphone, I caught Richard's expression, a mixture of irritation and grudging respect. He hadn't expected me to speak at all, let alone to speak well. Returning to my table, I felt lighter somehow, as if I'd set down a burden I'd been carrying for too long. Jake squeezed my hand as I sat down. "That was perfect, Mom," he whispered. Exactly what needed to be said. The reception continued, moving into its final phase. As guests began to drift toward the exit, collecting wedding favors and offering final congratulations to the couple, I found myself approached by unexpected visitors. "Mrs. Donovan?" A woman in her 30s touched my arm hesitantly. "I'm Sarah Miller. Well, it was Sarah Jensen when I was in your class, about 20 years ago." I smiled, placing her after a moment. "Sarah, of course I remember you. You wrote that wonderful poem about the solar system that won the district competition." Her face lit up. "You remember that?" "I can't believe it. I'm a literature professor now, at the community college." "That doesn't surprise me at all," I said warmly. "You always had a way with words." "I've been wanting to reach out to you for ages," she continued. "I'm putting together a panel on influential educators for a conference next month, and I'd love for you to participate. I tried contacting you through your ex-husband's firm a while back, but his secretary said you'd moved away and left no forwarding address." Again, Richard's deliberate isolation tactics. I felt a flash of anger, quickly supplanted by resolve. "I'd be honored to participate, Sarah. Let me give you my current contact information." As I wrote down my details, 2 more former BOW students approached, each with similar stories of having tried to reach me without success. By the time the reception was winding down, I'd reconnected with 6 people from my professional past, each interaction reinforcing what I'd begun to suspect, that Richard had actively worked to sever my connections, to diminish my professional identity, to ensure that post-divorce, I would be seen as nothing more than his discarded wife rather than a respected educator in my own right. It was nearly midnight when I decided it was time to leave. Olivia and Brad had departed an hour earlier, whisked away to a luxury hotel before their honeymoon flight the next morning. Jake had left to relieve the babysitter watching his daughter, promising to visit me before returning to Seattle. Most of the guests had trickled out, leaving only the cleanup crew, a few lingering relatives, and Richard and Vanessa, holding court with the last of their important connections. As I gathered my purse and wrap, Marcus approached for a final time. "Mrs. Donovan, Margaret, I've been thinking," he said, uncharacteristically hesitant. "Rosewood Manor hosts a monthly dinner series featuring local notables, authors, artisans, community leaders. We've been looking for someone to speak about education reform, perhaps lead a discussion on literacy initiatives. Given what I've learned about your background today, I wonder if you might consider being our guest speaker next month?" I blinked, surprised both by the offer and the timing. "That's very kind, but I'm not sure I'm qualified. I was just a classroom teacher, not an administrator or policy expert." "With all due respect," Marcus replied firmly, "that's exactly why you're qualified. You've been in the trenches, seeing what works and what doesn't, and based on what I've observed today, You have plenty to say and the eloquence to say it well. Before I could respond, Richard materialized beside us, his smile tight. Ah, Marcus. Excellent event tonight. Your staff did a marvelous job. Marcus nodded coolly. Thank you. I was just inviting Margaret to be our featured speaker at next month's community leaders' dinner. Richard's expression flickered briefly before settling into something resembling amusement. Margaret, a featured speaker? He chuckled lightly, as if the very idea was charmingly absurd. That's very kind of you, but public speaking has never been her strong suit. She gets terribly nervous in front of crowds. I stared at him, momentarily, speechless. I'd spent 30 years speaking confidently in front of classrooms, leading parent-teacher conferences, presenting at education workshops. Yet he spoke about me as if I were a shy child, incapable of forming coherent thoughts in public. Actually, I said, my voice perfectly steady, I'd be delighted to accept Marcus. Education reform is something I've thought about extensively throughout my career. Richard's smile faltered. Maggie, be realistic. These events attract influential people from across the city. It's not like addressing a room full of third graders. The condescension in his tone crystallized something for me, a decision that had been forming since Marcus first rescued me from my isolated table. I turned to face my ex-husband fully, meeting his gaze with unwavering certainty. Richard, I said quietly, I spent 3 decades teaching children to find their voices. It's time I remembered how to use mine. I turned back to Marcus. I'll need the details for the event. And if you're open to it, I'd like to focus specifically on educational inequality and how community partnerships can help bridge the resource gap between affluent and struggling schools. Marcus smiled broadly. Perfect. I'll have my office. Send you the information tomorrow. Richard's face had darkened, but before he could respond, Vanessa appeared at his side, sliding her arm possessively through his. Darling, Senator Wilson is about to leave. We should say goodbye. She barely glanced at me, her dismissal complete. As they walked away, I heard Richard murmur, just humoring her. No need to worry. But there was a new tension in his shoulders, a stiffness that hadn't been there before. For perhaps the first time since our divorce, I had surprised him, had defied his narrative about who I was and what I was capable of. It was a small thing, agreeing to give a talk at a local venue, but it felt momentous. A declaration of independence, a reclaiming of my professional identity, a step toward the woman I had been before I allowed myself to be diminished. Can I offer you a ride home? Marcus asked as we walked toward the exit. Thank you, but I have my car, I replied. Besides, I think I need some time to process everything that's happened today. He nodded understandingly. It's been quite a day. Yes, I agreed. More significant than I could have imagined. Outside, the spring night was cool and clear, stars visible despite the city lights. As I walked to my car, a sensible sedan I'd purchased after the divorce when Richard kept our luxury vehicles, I felt a strange sense of anticipation, as if I were standing on the threshold of something important. The drive to my apartment was quiet, the streets nearly empty at this late hour. I found myself taking a different route home, one that passed by Westlake Elementary where I'd taught for so many years. The building was dark, of course, but even in silhouette, it represented a part of my identity I'd allowed to be overshadowed. My vocation, my contribution, my purpose beyond being a wife and mother. By the time I reached my apartment building, a sense of clarity had settled over me. The events of the day, from the humiliation of my initial seating assignment to the unexpected opportunity presented by Marcus, had forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about my marriage, my divorce, and the years since. I had allowed Richard to define me, to determine my worth, to shape how others saw me. And when he decided I no longer fit his image of success, I had retreated into a smaller life, accepting the diminished role he'd assigned me. No more. Inside my apartment, I kicked off my shoes and made a cup of tea, then settled at my small desk in the corner of the living room. Opening my laptop, I created a new document and began to type, ideas flowing faster than I could capture them. Educational inequality, resource disparities, community partnerships, literacy initiatives for underserved populations. All the things I'd thought about during my teaching career but had rarely voiced outside the teacher's lounge, because Richard had subtly but consistently suggested that my professional opinions were charming but not substantive. After all, I was just teacher, while he shaped policy and influenced decision-makers, as if nurturing young minds, recognizing their potential, guiding their development were somehow lesser contributions than drafting contracts or arguing motions. I worked until dawn broke, filling pages with insights and experiences from my 30 years in the classroom. By the time exhaustion finally overtook me, I had the outline for not just one talk, but a series, a comprehensive approach to education reform from the perspective of a frontline educator. When I finally fell into bed, the sun was rising, casting golden light across my simple bedroom. As I drifted toward sleep, a line from my wedding speech echoed in my mind. You never have to choose between the parts of yourself that matter. It was time I took my own advice. 3 days after the wedding, Jake and his family came for lunch before their flight back to Seattle. My tiny apartment barely contained their energy. 1-year-old Lily toddling unsteadily between furniture, pieces, Amanda unpacking the diaper bag with practiced efficiency, Jake setting the table with the mismatched dishes I'd acquired post-divorce. "Mom, this looks amazing," Jake said as I brought a homemade quiche to the table. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble." "It's hardly trouble to cook for my family," I replied, settling Lily into the high chair I'd purchased when they'd visited last Christmas. "Besides, I wanted to hear all about your impression of the wedding." Jake and Amanda exchanged glances. "It was elaborate," Amanda offered diplomatically. "Very elegant." "And I hear your speech was the highlight," Jake added, serving salad onto everyone's plates. "Olivia texted me yesterday, asking if you were still upset with her." I sighed, cutting tiny pieces of quiche for Lily. "I'm not upset with her exactly. Disappointed, yes. But mostly I'm sad that she's absorbed so much of her father's perspective without questioning it." "She mentioned you had quite a conversation," Jake pressed. "Said it made her think about things differently." "Good," I said simply. "That was the intention." Amanda, always the peacemaker, steered the conversation to lighter topics. Lily's new words, Jake's recent promotion, their plans to renovate their Seattle home. But as lunch progressed, I found myself studying my son's face, so like his father's in features, but so different in expression. Where Richard's eyes often calculated, Jake's simply saw. Where Richard's smile was a tool, strategic and measured, Jake's was a gift, freely given. How had I raised such a compassionate son within a marriage that had ultimately revealed itself as transactional? What had Jake seen or understood that Olivia had missed? "I've been invited to speak at a dinner series at Rosewood Manor," I said, as we cleared the dishes. "About education reform." Jake's face lit up. "Mom, that's fantastic. When is it?" "Next month. I've been working on my presentation since the wedding night." Amanda looked up from wiping Lily's face. "Wait, you've been up working on this for 3 nights straight? After everything else that happened at the wedding?" I laughed, somewhat embarrassed by my intensity. "I've had these ideas percolating for years. It just took the right catalyst to bring them to the surface." Jake studied me thoughtfully. "You know what I think? I think Dad's been telling everyone who you are for so long that you started to believe him. But that's never been who you are." His words struck me with unexpected force. "What do you mean?" "Dad always talked about you like you were this, I don't know, simple person. Sweet, but not ambitious. caring but not intellectual, a good mother but not much else. Jake shook his head. But that's not who you were in our house when he wasn't around. With us, you were this force of nature, passionate about ideas, constantly learning, pushing us to think critically. I stared at him, stunned by his perception. I used to wonder why you were one person with us and another when Dad was home, he continued. It took me until college to understand that you were accommodating his ego, making yourself smaller so he could feel bigger. Amanda nodded. The first time I met your mother, Jake had talked about her so much that I expected this intimidating, intellectual. Then I met this quiet woman who seemed afraid to express opinions at her own dinner table. It didn't add up. Their observations landed like physical blows, not because they were cruel, but because they were accurate. I had compartmentalized myself, reserving my true personality, my intellectual curiosity, my stronger opinions for spaces where they wouldn't threaten Richard's self-image as the family's primary thinker, the authority on all matters of consequence. After the divorce, Jake said gently, I kept waiting for you to, emerge, like a butterfly from a cocoon. But instead, you got even smaller. Moved into this tiny apartment. Stopped talking about your ideas for educational reform. Started qualifying everything you said as just my opinion or, but what do I know? I sank into a chair, emotions welling up unexpectedly. I didn't realize it was so obvious. To me it was, Jake said. Because I remember who you really are. And who is that? I whispered. A woman who taught me that questions are more important than answers. Who showed me that true strength isn't about power over others, but empowerment of others. Who demonstrated that listening is an act of love. He knelt beside my chair, taking my hand. You're the reason I became a social worker instead of following Dad into law. Because you showed me there are many ways to make a difference in this world, and the flashiest ones aren't always the most meaningful. Tears filled my eyes. I don't know when I lost sight of that woman. You didn't lose her, Amanda said, kindly. You just muted her for a while, but she's still there. We saw her in your wedding speech, and we're seeing her now in your excitement about this speaking opportunity. As they prepared to leave for the airport, Jake pulled me into a tight hug. Promise me something, Mom? Anything. No more shrinking, no more hiding your light. The world needs the real Margaret Donovan. I nodded against his shoulder. I'm working on it. After they left, the apartment felt emptier than usual. I wandered from room to room, seeing my living space through new eyes. The modest furnishings, the careful economizing, the absence of personal touches beyond a few family photos. Even my decor reflected a diminished sense of self, as if I didn't deserve to fully inhabit my own life. My phone chimed with a text message. It was from Olivia. Can we talk tomorrow? I've been thinking a lot about what you said. I replied, with a simple, yes, then set the phone aside, oddly calm. Whatever conversation awaited us, I would approach it as my authentic self, not as Richard's ex-wife, not as the woman who had been seated with the catering staff, but as Margaret Donovan, educator, mother, and woman of substance. That evening, I made a decision that had been forming since the wedding. I took out a notepad and began listing the professional contacts I still remembered. People who had respected my work as an educator before the divorce. Connections that Richard might have severed, but that could potentially be rebuilt. Former colleagues from Westlake Elementary, members of the district curriculum committee I'd served on, representatives from literacy nonprofits I'd volunteered with, the director of the education school at the local university where I'd occasionally supervised student teachers. Names and institutions filled the page. Some relationships had likely withered from neglect. Others might have been poisoned by whatever narrative Richard had spread about my departure. But some, perhaps many, could be rekindled. It was time to find out which ones. I reached for my phone and dialed the first number on my list. Diana Chen, who had been the assistant principal at Westlake before moving to the district office as curriculum director. "Diana, it's Margaret Donovan. I know it's been a while, but I was wondering if you might have time for coffee this week. There's something I'd like to discuss with you." As I spoke, my voice grew stronger, more assured. This wasn't just about a speaking engagement at Rosewood Manor or rebuilding my professional network. This was about reclaiming my identity, my purpose, my place in the world. It was about becoming, once again, the woman I had always been meant to be. The coffee shop was bustling with morning customers when Diana Chen walked in. I'd arrived 20 minutes early, choosing a quiet table, in the corner where we could speak privately. Diana spotted me immediately, her face lighting up with genuine pleasure. "Margaret!" She embraced me warmly. "It's been far too long." Diana looked exactly as I remembered, elegant, composed, with the same sharp intelligence shining in her eyes. As assistant principal at Westlake Elementary, she had been my most valued colleague, someone who recognized good teaching and fought to protect educational integrity against bureaucratic pressures. "Thank you for making time," I said as we settled at the table. "I know you must be busy." "Never too busy for you," she replied, studying my face. "Though I must say, your call was unexpected. Richard told everyone you'd moved to Arizona to be closer to family after the divorce. I had prepared myself for this, but still felt a twist of anger at the deliberate lie. I've been here all along, just a few miles from Westlake, actually." Diana's expression shifted from surprise to something harder. "He lied," she stated, flatly. Why am I not surprised? "You never liked him much," I observed, remembering how Diana had always maintained a cool professionalism around Richard at school functions. "He treated you like an accessory," she said bluntly. "Something to be displayed when useful and put away when not. I always wondered when you'd realize your value exceeded his estimation." Her directness was both startling and refreshing. "It took me longer than it should have." Diana waved away my self-criticism. "These things happen gradually, then suddenly. What matters is where you go from here." She paused as the barista delivered our coffees. Which brings me to the question, why? "Now, Margaret, what's changed?" I told her about the wedding, about being seated with the catering staff, about Marcus Patel's intervention and subsequent invitation to speak at Rosewood Manor. As I spoke, Diana's expression traveled from outrage to vindication. "I always knew that son of yours had a good head on his shoulders," she said when I mentioned Jake's observation about my diminished self. "So, you're giving this talk at Rosewood Manor. That's a start. But I suspect you didn't invite me for coffee just to catch up." I took a deep breath. "I want back in, Diana. Not necessarily to classroom teaching, though I wouldn't rule it out, but into education more broadly. Consulting, curriculum development, teacher training, advocacy work. But I've been out of the professional loop for 3 years, and before that, Richard systematically minimized your professional identity until it became secondary even to you," Diana finished for me. "I saw it happening, you know. We all did." I flinched at her assessment, harsh but accurate. "Then you understand my challenge. I need to rebuild my professional network, establish credentials beyond my teaching record. I was hoping you might have suggestions." Diana sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "As it happens, I do. The district is launching a literacy initiative for underserved schools next month. We're assembling a steering committee of educators, community partners, and literacy specialists. Your experience would be invaluable." Hope fluttered in my chest. "Do you think the superintendent would consider me, after so long away?" "Walter Gaines is still superintendent, and he always had tremendous respect for your work," Diana said. "But more importantly, I'm chairing the initiative, and I get to recommend committee members." She smiled. "Consider yourself recommended." Just like that? I couldn't hide my surprise. "Margaret, good educators are rare. Great ones like you are precious resources. The system needs you far more than you need it. She leaned forward. But I should warn you, Richard's law firm has provided pro bono legal services to the district. For years. He has relationships with board members, administrators. The implication was clear. If I stepped back into educational circles, I would inevitably cross paths with my ex-husband, potentially setting up direct conflicts of interest or influence. I understand, I said slowly. But I can't let that stop me. I've allowed Richard to define my boundaries for too long. Diana nodded, satisfied. That's what I hoped you'd say. She pulled out her tablet and opened her calendar. The first steering committee meeting is next Thursday evening. Can you make it? I'll be there, I promised, feeling a surge of purpose I hadn't experienced in years. As we finished our coffee, Diana asked casually, "Have you spoken with Lawrence Matthews recently?" The name caught me off guard. Lawrence Matthews had been my mentor during my student teaching days, later becoming one of the most respected education policy consultants in the state. Not in years, I admitted. Not since Richard's firm represented the teachers' union in that contract dispute, and Lawrence was on the opposing side. Richard thought it would be inappropriate for me to maintain the friendship. Diana's expression hardened. And you agreed to cut ties with one of the most influential educators in your professional life because your husband found it inconvenient? Put that way, the decision seemed not just unfair but absurd. I thought I was being supportive, I said weakly. Well, Lawrence has been asking about you. He's leading a statewide task force on education equity, the very issue you've been passionate about for decades. I happen to know he's looking for experienced educators to serve as regional representatives. My heart raced at the possibility. You think he'd consider me after all this time? Diana smiled. I think he's been waiting for you to resurface. I'll send him your contact information if that's all right. Yes, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. Yes, please do. By the time we parted, I had not only a place on the Literacy Initiative Steering Committee, but 3 more contacts to follow up with, each representing a potential pathway back into the educational community I'd allowed myself to be separated from. I walked home with a lighter step than I'd had in years, possibilities unfurling before me like the spring flowers beginning to bloom along the sidewalk. The narrow life I'd accepted after the divorce suddenly seemed like a temporary condition rather than a permanent sentence. My phone chimed with a text message from Olivia. Just checking we're still on for coffee at 2? I can come to your place if that's easier. I replied affirmatively, suggesting a cafe equidistant between my apartment and her office. Whatever conversation awaited us, I wanted neutral ground. At home, I spent an hour updating my professional resume, surprised by how substantial it looked when I included all my committee work, curriculum development projects, and specialized training, elements I'd downplayed for years because Richard had characterized them as volunteer activities rather than professional accomplishments. 30 years of dedicated service, innovation, and impact reduced to a sidebar in my own life story. Never again. At precisely 2 o'clock, I arrived at the cafe to find Olivia already waiting, a leather portfolio on the table beside her coffee cup. She stood when she saw me, her usual confidence tempered by something that looked almost like nervousness. "Mom," she said, embracing me briefly. "Thank you for meeting me." "Of course," I replied, settling across from her. "I'm glad you reached out." Olivia looked tired, I realized. The radiant bride of 3 days ago had been replaced by a young woman with shadows under her eyes and tension in her shoulders. "I've been thinking about what you said at the wedding," she began, her fingers restlessly tracing the edge of her portfolio. "About how I've been complicit in minimizing your contributions, your value." Her directness surprised me. I had expected defensiveness, perhaps even accusation, the conversational style she'd adopted from Richard when confronted with uncomfortable truths. "I was angry when I said those things," I acknowledged, but that doesn't make them untrue. I know. She met my eyes squarely. I've been replaying conversations in my mind, examining my assumptions, remembering things I'd forgotten or chosen not to see. And I owe you an apology, Mom. A profound one. I sat very still, unwilling to interrupt whatever process of realization she was working through. When Dad left you, she continued, I was confused and hurt. I couldn't understand how our family could just break. So I looked for explanations that would make sense of it. She took a shaky breath. And the explanation Dad offered, that you were too different, that you'd grown apart, that he needed more intellectual stimulation than you could provide. It gave me a framework, a story I could tell myself. And believing that story was easier than confronting the possibility that your father had simply decided I was disposable, I said quietly. Olivia flinched. Yes, because if that was true, it meant everything I thought I knew about him, about our family, was a lie. She pushed her coffee cup aside, her movements agitated. But that's exactly what it was, wasn't it? A comfortable lie that allowed him to pursue what he wanted without confronting the moral implications of his choices. Her insight was startling, not just in its accuracy but in what it revealed about her own process of awakening. What changed, Olivia? Why are you seeing things differently now? She opened her portfolio and removed a stack of photographs, spreading them on the table. Between us. I recognized them immediately, family photos spanning decades. Olivia's first day of kindergarten, with me kneeling beside her, fixing the bow in her hair. A Christmas morning with Jake and Olivia flanking me on the couch, all of us in matching pajamas, laughing at something off camera. A school science fair where I stood proudly beside Olivia's volcano project, Richard noticeably absent. After our conversation, I couldn't sleep, Olivia explained. I kept thinking about what you said, about setting an example for my own children, someday about how to treat people. So I pulled out my old photo albums, thinking I'd find evidence to contradict you, to prove that Dad had been equally involved, equally present. She gestured at the photographs. But what I found was this. Hundreds of moments where you were there, and he wasn't. School events, doctor appointments, everyday homework sessions. And even when he was physically present, he was often distant, checking his phone, thinking about work. Your father worked very hard to build his career, I said automatically, the defense so habitual it emerged before I could stop it. Olivia's expression hardened. So did you, Mom. You worked full-time, managed our home, shepherded us through every developmental milestone, and still found energy to help with Dad's firm's charity events and host dinners for his colleagues. The difference is, your work was treated as expected, while his was treated as exceptional. Her clarity was both vindicating and painful. When did you become so insightful? A wry smile touched her lips. Apparently, I have a capacity for critical thinking when I actually use it. Another gift from you that I've taken for granted. She gathered the photos, handling them with newfound reverence. There's something else. After the wedding, I overheard Dad and Vanessa talking. They didn't know I was within earshot. Vanessa was complaining about how Marcus Patel had embarrassed them by moving you to a prominent table, and Dad said... She broke off, clearly struggling with whether to continue. What did he say, Olivia? She met my eyes, her own filled with a mixture of anger and regret. He said, "Don't worry about Margaret. She's harmless. By next week, she'll be back to her quiet little life, just grateful we included her at all." And Vanessa laughed and said, "At least we made sure none of her teacher friends were invited. Can you imagine how boring that would have been?" The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. Not just the words themselves, but the fact that they still had the power to wound me after everything else that had happened. "I'm so sorry, Mom," Olivia whispered. I stood there listening to them dismiss you like that, and suddenly all I could see was every time I'd done the same thing. Every time I'd accepted Dad's version of who you were without question. Every time I'd treated you as less than the incredible woman who raised me. Tears welled in my eyes, not from hurt but from a profound sense of breakthrough. My daughter was really seeing me, perhaps for the first time in years. "Thank you for telling me this," I said softly. "It couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't," she agreed. "But it's time for honesty between us." She hesitated. "There's something else you should know, something I discovered when I was helping Dad organize his home office last month." My pulse quickened at her serious tone. "What is—" I found a file with your name on it." Inside was correspondence with various people in educational circles, principals, curriculum directors, even some education nonprofits. Letters where Dad, writing as your husband, declined invitations on your behalf. Emails where he provided false information about your availability or interests. Cold clarity washed over me. He was systematically isolating me professionally, creating distance between me and my colleagues. Olivia nodded, her expression grim. "It goes back at least 15 years, Mom. Long before the divorce. Some of the letters date from when I was in middle school." The revelation settled like a stone in my stomach. 15 years. While we were still married, still presenting as a happy family, Richard had been deliberately undermining my professional identity, narrowing my world until it contained only roles that served his needs. Wife, mother, hostess. "I think he was afraid," Olivia said quietly. "Afraid of what you might become if you fully embraced your potential. Afraid you might outgrow him, or at least outgrow the confined space he'd allocated for you in his life." Her insight was startlingly perceptive and likely accurate. Richard's insecurity had always been carefully disguised beneath layers of confidence and charm, but it had manifested in subtle ways throughout our marriage. His dismissal of my professional accomplishments, his discomfort when colleagues praised my teaching innovations, his insistence that I decline the District Teacher of the Year nomination because it would take too much time away from the family. "I confronted him about it," Olivia continued. "He said he was just protecting you from overextending yourself, that you were happiest focusing on home and family." "And you didn't believe him," I observed. She shook her head. "Not anymore. Not after seeing how deliberately he's misrepresented you to others. Not after watching him seat you with the catering staff at my wedding." The mention of the wedding seating brought us full circle. "I understand why you're upset with him, Olivia. But I need to understand your role in this. You knew about the seating arrangement. You defended it when I questioned it." Olivia's shoulders slumped. "I did. And that's the hardest part of all. Recognizing that I wasn't just a bystander to his behavior, I was a participant." She looked at me directly. "When Dad first suggested having you seated separately, he framed it as a kindness to you, saying you'd be uncomfortable at the head table with all the attention, that you'd prefer somewhere quiet. And I wanted to believe that because it made the decision easier." "But you knew me better than that," I said softly. "You knew it would hurt me to be excluded." "Yes," she whispered. "I knew. I just didn't want to deal with the conflict of standing up to Dad. It was easier to go along, to accept his framing, to tell myself you wouldn't mind." Her honesty was both painful and healing, acknowledgement of the hurt she'd caused, but also recognition of the deeper pattern at work. "What happens now?" I asked. Olivia squared her shoulders. "Now I make different choices, starting with this." She reached into her portfolio again and withdrew an envelope, sliding it across the table. "An invitation to dinner next Saturday at our new house. Just you, me, and Brad. No Dad, no Vanessa, no performative family dynamics. Just us, getting reacquainted as adults." I accepted the envelope, touched by the formal gesture. "I'd like that very much. And I'd like to hear about this speaking engagement at Rosewood Manor," she added. Jake mentioned it when we spoke yesterday. It sounds like an amazing opportunity. The simple expression of interest in my professional life, something that had been notably absent from our relationship in recent years, brought a lump to my throat. It's a start, I said, one of several new beginnings I'm pursuing. Olivia tilted her head inquiringly. Oh? I told her about my coffee with Diana Chen, about the literacy initiative, about the possibility of connecting with Lawrence Matthews. As I spoke, I watched her expression shift from surprise to something approaching admiration. "You've been busy," she observed when I finished. "I've been awakened," I corrected gently, to possibilities I'd stopped allowing myself to imagine. Olivia reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "I want to hear about all of it, Mom. Everything you're doing, everything you're thinking about doing. No more filtered versions of yourself to make others comfortable. I want to know who you really are." The gift of her attention, her genuine interest, was almost overwhelming after years of having my professional identity treated as peripheral, even by my own daughter. "I'd like that," I managed, blinking back tears. "We should get together weekly," Olivia suggested, suddenly animated. "Standing lunch dates or coffee. Something regular, protected time." I smiled at her enthusiasm. "That sounds wonderful." As our conversation continued, I felt a shift in our dynamic, a rebalancing of respect, a recognition of each other as complete individuals rather than just roles within a family system. We were finding our way toward something new, a relationship based on mutual understanding rather than inherited patterns. When we finally parted 2 hours later, Olivia embraced me with a fierceness that reminded me of her childhood hugs, wholehearted, uninhibited by the self-consciousness that had characterized our interactions in recent years. "I love you, Mom," she whispered. "The real you, not just the version Dad wanted us to see." "I love you too," I replied, holding her tightly. "Always have, always will." Walking home, I felt both lighter and more grounded than I had in years. The revelations of the day, Richard's systematic professional sabotage, Olivia's awakening to her own complicity, the possibility of rebuilding not just my career but my relationship with my daughter, had shifted something fundamental in my understanding of the past and my vision for the future. The narrow life I'd accepted post-divorce was revealed for what it truly was. Not an inevitable diminishment, but a carefully constructed constraint, one I had the power to dismantle. My phone rang just as I reached my apartment building. An unfamiliar number, but I answered anyway, still buoyed by the afternoon's breakthroughs. Margaret Donovan speaking. "Margaret, it's Lawrence Matthews. Diana Chen gave me your number. I hope this isn't an inconvenient time." I nearly dropped the phone in surprise. Lawrence Matthews, the most influential education policy consultant in the state, my former mentor, a connection I had severed at Richard's insistence years ago, was calling me directly? "Lawrence, no, this is perfect timing. It's wonderful to hear your voice." "Likewise," he said warmly. "It's been far too long. Diana mentioned you might be interested in rejoining the education policy conversation. I hope that's true, because I have a proposition for you." I unlocked my apartment door, stepping into the quiet space that had felt confining just that morning, but now seemed full of possibility. "I'm all ears." "I'm chairing a statewide task force on educational equity, looking specifically at resource allocation disparities between affluent and underserved districts. We're assembling a team of regional representatives, experienced educators who understand both the classroom reality and the systemic challenges. Diana speaks very highly of your insights in this area." Pride swelled in my chest. Not vanity, but honest recognition of my own expertise, something I'd been conditioned to downplay for too long. Education equity has been a passion of mine throughout my career. "Exactly why you're perfect for this," Lawrence replied. "The position would involve research, community outreach, policy development, substantial work with the potential for real impact. And I should mention it comes with a stipend. Not enough to make anyone rich, but recognition that expertise has value. The implicit respect in his words, treating my professional knowledge as something of worth rather than a hobby or side interest, nearly brought me to tears. When would you need an answer? Take a few days to consider, of course, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that our first full task force meeting is next Friday in the Capitol. If you're interested, I'd love to have you there. I'm interested, I said firmly. Very interested. But yes, let me think through the logistics and get back to you by Monday. Is that acceptable? More than acceptable, Lawrence assured me. And Margaret? It really is good to hear your voice again. The education community has missed your contributions. After we disconnected, I sat in my living room, phone still in hand, mind racing with possibilities. In the span of a single day, my professional horizons had expanded exponentially, from a lone speaking engagement at Rosewood Manor to potential roles on a district literacy initiative and a statewide education equity task force. Roles that would inevitably bring me into Richard's sphere of influence again, but this time on my own terms, with my own support network, my own professional standing. My phone chimed with an incoming email. It was from Marcus Patel, with details about the Rosewood Manor speaking engagement. As I scrolled through the information, a line near the bottom caught my attention. We typically record these presentations for our community education archives. With your permission, we'd also like to feature excerpts on our website and social media channels. Your insights on educational equity would be valuable to a wider audience. A wider audience. My perspectives, my expertise, available beyond the confines of a single event or committee. Another email arrived, this one from Diana Chen, confirming the Literacy Initiative meeting details and adding, "Several committee members expressed excitement about your involvement. Your reputation as an innovative educator endures, despite Richard's efforts. My reputation, my professional identity. Things I had allowed to be diminished, obscured, almost erased, but never completely destroyed. The final revelation washed over me with quiet certainty. Richard had never actually succeeded in erasing me. He had only convinced me to erase myself, to accept his definition of my worth, to internalize his limitations on my potential. But beneath that imposed smallness, I had always remained who I truly was. A dedicated educator, a thoughtful innovator, a woman of substance and insight. That woman was re-emerging now, not as someone new, but as someone rediscovered. Someone who had been there all along, waiting for permission to exist fully again. I was done waiting for permission. Done accepting artificial constraints. Done living within boundaries drawn by someone else's insecurity. The rest of the day passed in a flurry of activity as I drafted emails, scheduled meetings, researched the educational equity issues I would likely be addressing in my new roles. By evening, I had created a simple website highlighting my educational philosophy and experience, a professional digital presence I had never bothered to establish before. As I worked, my apartment seemed to expand around me, no longer a diminished substitute for the life I'd lost, but the launching pad for the life I was choosing. The modest furniture, the simple decor. These weren't symbols of reduction, but of distillation, of identifying what truly mattered. What mattered was purpose, connection, contribution, the opportunity to use my gifts in service of something larger than myself. Richard had never understood that about me. He had mistaken my contentment with simplicity for lack of ambition, my focus on impact rather than status for limitation. His misunderstanding was no longer my problem. As twilight fell, I made a cup of tea and stood at my small balcony, watching the city lights emerge against the darkening sky. In 3 days, my world had transformed. From the humiliation of being Seated with the catering staff at my daughter's wedding, to the exhilaration of reclaiming my professional identity and rebuilding my relationship with Olivia. Not because of luck or coincidence, but because I had finally recognized the truth that had been there all along. I was, and always had been, the author of my own story. It had taken Marcus Patel's intervention to remind me of that fact, to crack, open the door to possibility. But I was the one walking through that door now, step by purposeful step. The revelation wasn't that I needed to become someone new. It was that I needed to remember who I had always been. 1 month after Olivia's wedding, I stood at the podium in Rosewood Manor's grand ballroom, looking out at a crowd 3 times larger than Marcus Patel had initially predicted. News of my speaking engagement had spread throughout the educational community, attracting current and former teachers, administrators, community activists, and even several school board members. Education is not merely the transmission of information, I said, my voice steady despite the butterflies that had plagued me all day. It is the cultivation of humanity in its fullest expression. When we allow inequity to persist in our schools, we aren't just failing individual students, we're failing our collective future. From my vantage point, I could see Diana Chen nodding in the 3rd row, Lawrence Matthews taking notes near the back, and, most surprisingly, Olivia and Brad, seated at a table near the front, listening intently. My daughter had rearranged a client dinner to attend, telling me she wanted to see the real you in your element. The question before us isn't whether we can afford to address educational inequity, I continued, warming to my subject. It's whether we can afford not to. Every child who drops out, every student whose potential goes unrecognized, every mind that never discovers its unique gifts, these represent incalculable losses to our society. For 45 minutes, I outlined my vision for educational equity, practical strategies for resource reallocation, community partnerships, teacher empowerment, and student advocacy. Ideas I'd developed over decades in the classroom but had rarely voiced in public forums, constrained by Richard's subtle discouragement and my own internalized limitations. When I finished, the applause was immediate and sustained. As I gathered my notes, Marcus approached the podium, beaming with satisfaction. I think it's safe to say we'll need a larger venue when we invite you back, he murmured as he shook my hand. There's a line of people waiting to speak with you. Indeed, a queue had formed beside the stage, educators wanting to share their experiences, community members offering partnerships, parents expressing gratitude for articulating challenges they'd observed in their children's schools. Olivia remained seated, watching as I engaged with each person, her expression a mixture of pride and something that looked almost like awe. When the last well-wisher had departed, she approached, Brad a supportive presence at her shoulder. "Mom," she said simply, embracing me. That was incredible. "Thank you for coming," I replied, suddenly shy about accepting her praise. "I wouldn't have missed it," she insisted. "I had no idea you were so powerful." The word struck me. Powerful. Not in the sense of authority over others, but in the capacity to articulate truth, to inspire action, to envision possibility. Neither did I admitted. At least I'd forgotten. Brad, always perceptive, touched Olivia's arm. "I'll get the car while you two talk." As he stepped away, Olivia took both my hands in hers. "I keep thinking about everything I missed. All the years I saw you through Dad's lens instead of clearly, with my own eyes. All the times I diminished you because it was easier than challenging his narrative." "We can't change the past," I said gently. "Only our path forward." Speaking of which, Olivia reached into her handbag and extracted a small jewelry box. "I have something for you." I opened it to find a delicate silver bracelet, inscribed on the inside with 3 simple words: author, teacher, mother. "To remind you of who you are," Olivia explained, "in your own right, not defined by anyone else's expectations." Tears sprang to my eyes as I fastened it around my wrist. It's perfect. Olivia glanced at her watch reluctantly. We should go. Brad has an early surgery tomorrow, but I'll see you Sunday for our lunch. I'll be there, I promised, marveling at how quickly our weekly meetings had become a cherished anchor in both our lives. After they left, I lingered in the now empty ballroom, running my fingers over the inscription on my new bracelet. Author. Teacher, mother. 3 facets of my identity, each valuable, each authentic, none diminishing the others. Margaret. Diana approached from where she'd been chatting with Lawrence Matthews. That was magnificent. You've been holding out on us all these years. I laughed, still flying high on the success of the evening. Not holding out, just contained. Well, you're certainly uncontained now, Lawrence observed, joining us. We've already had inquiries from 3 districts about having you conduct professional development sessions on equity frameworks. Really? I blinked in surprise. Really, Diana confirmed. Your perspective resonates, practical enough for classroom teachers to implement, visionary enough for administrators to champion, grounded enough for community partners to support. The Equity Task Force meets next week, Lawrence added. After tonight's performance, I think we need to discuss expanding your role beyond regional representative. Performance. Role. The terminology struck me as both foreign and fitting. I was, in many ways, stepping onto a new stage, inhabiting a more public version of the professional identity I'd always privately maintained. As we walked out together, Diana mentioned casually, Walter Gaines was here tonight, our superintendent, remember? He was quite impressed. Don't be surprised if he reaches out directly. The evening had been a triumph by any measure. Personally, professionally, even spiritually, I had spoken my truth before an audience that included colleagues, community members, and my own daughter. I had been heard, respected, engaged with as a person of substance and insight. Yet the most profound victory wasn't the external validation, gratifying though it was. It was the internal alignment, the feeling of congruence between who I knew myself to be and how I was showing up in the world. That alignment continued to deepen over the following weeks as I immersed myself in my new professional commitments. The District Literacy Initiative was moving forward with energy and purpose, our steering committee meeting weekly to develop implementation strategies. Lawrence's Equity Task Force had indeed expanded my role, asking me to chair the resource allocation subcommittee based on the framework I'd outlined in my Rosewood Manor presentation. And true to Diana's prediction, Superintendent Gaines had reached out, inviting me to consult on a district-wide professional development initiative focused on classroom-level equity practices. My calendar, once populated primarily with grocery, shopping, and solitary walks, now overflowed with meetings, presentations, collaboration sessions. My modest apartment had become a hub of activity, with educators and community partners often gathering around my small dining table to draft proposals or review research. Life was full, purposeful, occasionally overwhelming, and utterly authentic. The only shadow on this period of renaissance was the knowledge that my expanding professional presence would eventually bring me into direct contact with Richard. His law firm's long-standing relationship with the school district made such an encounter inevitable, particularly as my role in various educational initiatives grew more prominent. That moment arrived sooner than I expected, at a school board meeting where the Literacy Initiative was presenting its first quarter progress report. I was scheduled to outline the community partnership component, a network of local businesses, nonprofits, and civic organizations we'd mobilize to support literacy enrichment activities. I spotted Richard the moment I entered the boardroom. He sat near the front with several colleagues from his firm, there to discuss an unrelated contract matter. When he saw me, his expression flickered briefly with surprise before settling into something more calculated. Diana squeezed my arm encouragingly as we took our seats in the presenter section. Ready for this? As I'll ever be, I replied, straightening the collar of my new blouse, a vibrant blue that Olivia had helped me select, insisting it brought out my eyes and projected confidence. The literacy initiative was third on the agenda. As Diana introduced our team and outlined the overall program, I reviewed my speaking notes, determined to focus on our work rather than Richard's presence. When my turn came, I approached the podium with measured steps, conscious of his gaze but refusing to be diminished by it. Good evening, board members, I began. The strength of our literacy initiative lies in its community integration. We've established partnerships with 28 local entities, from the public library system to small businesses, creating a comprehensive support network for our most vulnerable young readers. As I detailed the innovative arrangements we'd developed, bookstore reading hours, restaurant vocabulary programs, senior center intergenerational reading partnerships, I could feel the board's growing interest. Several members leaned forward, nodding appreciatively. One jotted continuous notes. Only Richard remained impassive, his expression carefully neutral as he watched me command the room with an authority he had likely never witnessed during our marriage. When the presentation concluded, board members responded with enthusiasm, asking thoughtful questions that allowed our team to highlight additional aspects of the program. The board president, a retired principal I'd known peripherally for years, addressed me directly. Mrs. Donovan, this community partnership framework is exceptional. Have you considered developing it into a model that could be shared with other districts? Before I could respond, Richard cleared his throat. If I might interject, he said smoothly, while the partnership concept has merit, there are liability considerations the board should examine before encouraging broader implementation. My firm would be happy to review the agreements pro bono, of course. The familiar strategy, offering help that would simultaneously establish his authority and place him in a position to control outcomes, was so transparent I almost laughed. Instead, I smiled pleasantly. Thank you for your concern, Mr. Donovan. However, the partnership agreements were developed in collaboration with the district's legal team and reviewed by education law specialists at State University's Policy Center. They've already been formatted as templates for potential adoption by other districts, with all liability considerations addressed. Richard's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Even so, having experienced education attorneys review the documents could only strengthen the initiative. I couldn't agree more, I replied evenly. That's why Lawrence Matthews, who, as you know, specializes in education policy law, has been consulting with us from the beginning. But I appreciate your firm's generous offer. A flash of annoyance crossed Richard's face at the mention of Lawrence, a professional peer he respected but had always considered something of a rival. Before he could respond, the board president intervened. It seems the legal aspects have been thoroughly addressed, she observed. Let's move on to implementation timelines. As the meeting progressed, I could feel Richard watching me, reevaluating, recalculating. The dynamic between us had shifted. Fundamentally, no longer husband and wife, not even simply ex-spouses, but professional counterparts operating in the same sphere from different positions of influence. When the meeting adjourned, I chatted briefly with board members and fellow presenters, deliberately unhurried despite my awareness of Richard hovering nearby, clearly waiting for an opportunity to approach. Finally, as the room cleared, he made his move. "Margaret," he said, his tone carefully calibrated to convey civilized cordiality. "I didn't realize you were involved with the literacy initiative." "There's a lot you don't realize about my professional activities these days," I replied pleasantly. "How are you, Richard?" He studied me with the assessing gaze I remembered from our marriage, the look that had once made me feel simultaneously seen and scrutinized. "You look different. Teaching must be agreeing with you." "I'm not back in the classroom," I corrected him. "I'm consulting on several educational equity initiatives." chairing the Resource Allocation Subcommittee of the State Task Force, and developing professional development frameworks for the district. Richard blinked, momentarily disconcerted by this litany of professional engagements. That sounds quite demanding, especially at our age. Our age, the subtle dig, suggesting that my renewed professional activity was somehow inappropriate for a woman in her late 50s, was so predictable I almost felt sorry for him. I find it energizing, I said simply. Purpose has a way of keeping one vital, don't you think? Before he could respond, Diana appeared at my side. Margaret, we should head out if we're going to make our dinner reservation. Lawrence and the others are waiting. Richard's expression soured at the mention of Lawrence again, a reminder that I now moved in professional circles he considered his domain. Of course, I said. Richard, it was good to see you. Likewise, he replied automatically. Then, as I turned to leave, he added, Olivia mentioned you two have been spending more time together recently. I paused, recognizing the implied question, the hint of discomfort at being excluded from this renewed mother-daughter connection. Yes, we have weekly lunches now. It's been wonderful reconnecting as adults. A complicated emotion flickered across his face, something between jealousy and concern. She seems different with you. More open. People often respond to authenticity with authenticity, I observed. Give my best to Vanessa. As Diana and I walked away, she murmured, That was masterfully handled. Was it? I hadn't approached the encounter as a contest to be won, merely as an interaction to be navigated with integrity. Absolutely. You were professional, cordial, and completely undiminished by his presence. The Margaret Donovan of a year ago would have shrunk in that situation, apologized for taking up space. She was right, I realized. The woman I had been, the woman who had accepted being seated with the catering staff at her daughter's wedding, would have experienced that encounter very differently. Would have felt the need to justify her presence, to minimize her accomplishments, to defer to Richard's judgment. That woman was gone. The dinner that followed was lively and productive, our team of educators celebrating the successful board presentation while strategizing next steps. Lawrence Matthews, seated beside me, leaned over during dessert. I heard Richard Donovan tried to insert himself into our initiative today. I shrugged. Old habits. He likes to position himself at the center of any significant project. Well, he's going to have to get used to your presence in these circles, Lawrence said. The state education department has asked about bringing you on as a consultant for their teacher retention program. The formal offer should come through next week. Another opportunity, another expansion of my professional horizons. I'd be very interested in exploring that. I thought you might be, Lawrence smiled. The education world is finally getting to know the Margaret Donovan some of us recognized years ago. The evening ended with warm goodbyes and plans for our next meeting. As I drove home, I reflected on how dramatically my life had transformed in the span of a few short months, from the isolated existence I'd accepted after the divorce to this rich tapestry of professional engagement, renewed relationships, and authentic self-expression. The following Sunday, I met Olivia for our weekly lunch, this time at a small cafe near her new home. She arrived looking relaxed and happy, a marked contrast to the tightly wound professional persona she'd cultivated in recent years. Dad mentioned, "He saw you at the school board meeting," she said after we'd ordered. He seemed unsettled by it. I smiled. I imagine he was. Our roles have shifted in ways he never anticipated. He told Vanessa that you've suddenly developed ambitions, Olivia reported, making air quotes with her fingers. As if your professional expertise just materialized overnight. Your father has always had a selective memory, I observed. It's more comfortable for him to believe I've changed than to acknowledge he never truly saw me. Olivia nodded thoughtfully. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, how we Construct narratives about the people in our lives that serve our own needs. Dad needed you to be simpler, less accomplished, more dependent. So that's how he portrayed you. And I accepted that portrayal because it was easier than questioning his authority. Her insight, so clear-eyed, so unflinching, filled me with pride. That's a powerful realization. It's made me look at my relationship with Brad differently, she admitted. Am I really seeing him, or just the version of him that fits my expectations? Am I making space for all of who he is, or just the parts that align with my plans? These were questions I wished I had asked myself decades earlier. The fact that you're considering them at all suggests you're on a healthier path than I was at your age. Olivia reached across the table to squeeze my hand. Because I have you modeling a different way forward now, showing me what it looks like to reclaim your authentic self, to live with integrity. Her words touched me deeply. For so many years, I had worried about what kind of example I was setting for my children, particularly after the divorce, when I feared they would see only my diminishment, my reduction to a smaller life. Now, unexpectedly, I was offering a different kind of maternal example, not of martyrdom or self-sacrifice, but of self-reclamation, of refusing to be defined by someone else's limitations. Our conversation shifted to lighter topics: Brad's work at the hospital, my upcoming presentation at the state education conference, a film we both wanted to see. As we talked, I noticed a new quality in our interaction: an ease, a mutual respect, a genuine interest in each other's thoughts that had been missing in recent years. By the way, Olivia said as we finished our meal, Jake and Amanda are bringing Lily for a visit next month. They specifically asked if we could all have dinner. At your place, Jake says your apartment feels more like home than Dad's new house ever will. The simple preference warmed my heart. My modest apartment, once a symbol of reduction, had become a place of authenticity and connection, filled with books that reflected my interests, furnished for comfort rather than impression, animated by genuine conversation rather than performative socializing. I'd love that, I said. It's been too long since we've all been together. On the drive home, I found myself reflecting on the nature of reinvention. The term implied creating something new, becoming someone different. But my experience had been more like excavation, removing layers of restriction and expectation to reveal the person who had been there all along. The woman who now consulted on educational policy, who spoke confidently at professional gatherings, who engaged with her adult children as intellectual peers. She wasn't a new creation. She was simply the unobscured version of the woman I had always been, freed from the constraints I had both accepted and internalized. As I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment building, I noticed a familiar figure waiting near the entrance. Marcus Patel, holding a small gift bag. Marcus, I greeted him, genuinely pleased by the unexpected visit. What brings you here? Good news that couldn't wait, he replied, his expression jubilant. Remember how we recorded your presentation at Rosewood Manor? I nodded. The video had been posted on the venue's website, garnering significantly more views than their typical community education content. The State Education Association saw it, Marcus continued. They've selected you for their Lifetime Achievement in Educational Advocacy Award. The ceremony is next month. I stared at him, momentarily speechless. The State Association's recognition was significant, a formal acknowledgement of contribution to the field of education. This can't be right, I finally managed. Those awards go to administrators, policymakers, major donors, not to classroom teachers. That's exactly why they selected you, Marcus explained. Your perspective bridges the gap between policy and practice. Your advocacy comes from lived experience, not abstract theory. He handed me the gift bag, a small token of congratulations. Inside was a framed photograph, me at the podium, during my Rosewood Manor presentation, captured in profile as I gestured emphatically to illustrate a point. My expression was animated, engaged, completely absorbed in communicating something I deeply believed. "I've never seen myself like this," I said softly. "That's how everyone else sees you," Marcus replied, passionate, authoritative, compelling. I invited him in for tea, and as we sat in my small living room, he shared more details about the award ceremony and the association's interest in having me develop a teacher mentoring program based on my equity framework. "Your son will be so proud," Marcus observed as he prepared to leave. "Ryan never stops talking about the difference you made in his life." "I'd love to see him sometime," I said. "Hear about his medical career firsthand." "He'll be at the award ceremony," Marcus promised. Wild horses couldn't keep him away. After he departed, I stood in my living room, still holding the framed photograph, still processing the unexpected recognition. The State Association's award represented something I had never sought or expected: public acknowledgement of my professional contribution, validation of my expertise, confirmation of my impact. Yet even this honor, gratifying as it was, felt secondary to the deeper satisfaction of living in alignment with my truest self. The real achievement wasn't the award, but what it represented: the reclamation of my voice, my purpose, my rightful place in the world I had helped to shape. My phone chimed with a text message from Jake. "Just heard the news from Marcus. So proud of you, Mom. Knew the world would eventually see what we've always known." Then another from Olivia. "Dad just called, sounding weirdly conflicted about your award. Said he always knew you had potential." I nearly laughed out loud, as if he ever acknowledged it. "So proud of you, Mom. You deserve every bit of this recognition." Their support, their pride, their clear-eyed recognition of both my achievement and Richard's revisionist response, all of it felt like the completion of a circle, the healing of old wounds, the restoration of truth where falsehood had prevailed. I placed the framed photograph on my mantel, then stepped back to consider its place among the other objects displayed there: family photos, treasured books, mementos of significant moments. The image of me at the podium, fully engaged in sharing my professional insights, belonged among these tokens of identity and value. It represented not a departure from my other roles, but an integration with them. Mother, teacher, author of my own story. The doorbell rang, interrupting my reflections. When I answered, I found a delivery person holding an elaborate floral arrangement. "Margaret Donovan?" he confirmed, consulting his clipboard. "Yes, that's me." "Special delivery. Congratulations on your award." The card attached to the flowers read simply, "Recognition long overdue. Your impact continues to ripple outward. L.M." Lawrence Matthews, my mentor turned colleague, the connection Richard had insisted I sever, now restored and strengthened by shared purpose and mutual respect. I arranged the flowers on my dining table, their vibrant colors brightening the entire room. Then I sat at my desk and opened my laptop, ready to continue working on the teacher mentoring framework Marcus had mentioned, ideas flowing with an ease born of experience, insight, and newfound freedom. As twilight settled over the city, I paused to make a cup of tea and stepped onto my small balcony. From this vantage point, I could see the lights coming on in buildings across the urban landscape: homes, offices, schools, community centers. Places where people lived and worked, taught and learned, struggled and thrived. My world had once contracted to the point where I could barely imagine my place within that broader community. Now it expanded daily as I reclaimed not just my professional identity, but my full humanity, my right to contribute, to influence, to matter. 6 months ago, I had been seated with the catering staff at my daughter's wedding, effectively erased from the celebration of a milestone I had helped make possible. The humiliation of that moment had seemed at the time like confirmation of my diminishment. Proof that in the post-divorce narrative Richard had constructed, I was a supporting character at best, an awkward footnote at worst. Now I understood that moment differently, not as an ending but as a beginning, a catalyst for awakening, a necessary disruption of the false equilibrium I had accepted. When Marcus Patel recognized me that day, truly saw me, acknowledged my worth, insisted on my rightful place, he had unknowingly set in motion a cascade of realignments, rediscoveries, and reclamations. But the true transformation hadn't been external. It had been internal. A shift in perception, in self-understanding, in the story I told myself about who I was and what I deserved. Standing on my balcony as the evening sky deepened to indigo, I felt a profound sense of homecoming. Not to a place, but to myself. To the woman I had always been beneath the layers of accommodation and compromise. To the authentic core that had remained true even when obscured. This was the ultimate reinvention, the return to original truth, the restoration of essential self, the reclamation of inherent worth. Not a becoming, but an unveiling. Not a creation, but a remembering. Not a new life, but the one that had been waiting all along. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.